So today I'll be talking about our work, and I'll be showing you how we use robots actually to understand the humans, because my background is cognitive neuroscience. I'm not a roboticist, so actually the human side of human-robot interaction interests me more. All right, so let's try to get this going. I will argue that it is very, very important, and I think this is the right place to make this argument, that it's very, very important to bridge, to make bridges between cognitive neuroscience and robotics, and that both disciplines can learn from one another, so that the direction is actually bidirectional learning. It's pretty clear for roboticists that having inspiration from neuroscience, from understanding cognitive mechanisms in the human, one can model them on the robot and make the robots maybe better adapted to the environment, to social interactions. That's pretty clear. The less explored avenue is the one from robotics. It's the one from robotics to neuroscience. How can we actually, in neuroscience, learn something from robotics? And I'll be today arguing that we actually can. All right, so this is the two ways that in cognitive neuroscience we can learn things from robotics. On the one hand, there is something that has been termed as understanding through building. So when we model cognitive mechanisms on robots specifically, because our robots are embodied. So it makes the AI more interesting in terms of interaction with the environment, because you actually have to take into account how the body works in the environment. When you start modeling cognitive mechanisms on robots, you understand better those mechanisms, right? This is like just one example of an elaborate model of a memory system that has been implemented on the ICAB. And what you can do is let's say, draw inspirations from the constructs, theoretical constructs that we have in neuroscience, and then put those modules into the architecture, cognitive architecture of the robot, and then see whether the robot is up to a certain task, for example, a memory task, whether that architecture actually serves the purpose. If not, then you have to reevaluate whether your constructs were actually correct. So it's an excellent way to test your theories, right? And then there is this other way of using robots in cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, is to use them as sophisticated apparatus in, let's say, interactive scenarios. And this is the part that I'll be talking today about, because this is how we are using robots. So here, what you can see is basically an illustration of an interactive paradigm. The approach that we take in our lab is typically that we take, let's say, established cognitive psychology, experimental psychology paradigms, and we try to translate them into more interactive scenarios. So if you take an attentional task, instead of having stimuli on the screen that are very abstract, we try to implement that in a little bit more interactive setup. And as participants are engaged in an interaction, we measure, like this, again, just an example of the methods we're using. We measure their EEG, so neural activity. We measure where they look, attentional focus through mobile eye tracker. And then, of course, we give them the task as well, so that we can have also performance measures, reaction times, error rates, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's about the methods. Now, the mechanisms that we study in my lab, and don't worry, I'm not going to kill you with all this today. There'll be a lot, but not all of it. So we're interested in these topics that you see here. We're interested in the question of whether and under what conditions people adopt an intentional stance towards robots, and I'll be discussing this a little bit more later. We're very much interested in sense of agency in social context, so in interaction again with the robot. And here you see, this was a very ambitious experiment. I won't be talking to you about this today, but this is an experiment where we have a hyperscanning set up with 2 EEG systems and 2 humans. And this person is actually controlling this robot through teleoperation. So there's an interaction between those two, but through a robot. And they're doing a joint task, but through a robot. But I won't be discussing this much today. Then we are also interested in joint action. Obviously, since this is a human-robot interaction, you want to know what sort of mechanisms are involved in joint action. We are interested in going more and more in that direction of understanding cognitive conflict and control in social interactions, so executive functions in general, in the social context again. And actually, I'll start with those. We're interested also in social signals. What do they mean? Like if a robot displays social signals. And then finally, a little bit more applied topic of using robots. I hope that I will have time to finish with that part for training social skills in children diagnosed with autism. Now, I'm showing you all this because in case you're interested in any of these topics and I haven't covered them today, I'll be very happy to discuss later. We can, email later on. So today I'll be talking about those four, maybe, if time allowing, about those four mechanisms. So let's start with the social signals. This is, I'll run through some experiments that we've done as our very first experiments in Italy. So I won't focus very much on those because I would like to present to you a little bit more recent work, but I just wanted to mention the gaze cueing studies that we've done in the past. So social signals on a robot, what do they mean for humans? One of the important social signals, and I'm pretty sure that everybody here is very aware of that, is gaze, gaze direction, mutual gaze, these sort of signals that we transmit to one another in interactions. Now, one of the very classical paradigms to study engagement of the recipient of such a signal, like directional gaze, is a gaze cueing paradigm. I'm pretty sure that you know all about it. So it's a Posner type of paradigm where we cue participants' attention to one side with the eyes, directional cue. Then we present a target letter. Participants need to do something with the letter, so identify it or identify the location of the letter or what letter it is. And then in some trials, the directional cue cues towards the location where the letter will appear. In some other trials, it cues actually to the opposite direction, right? So in this case, if you're engaging your attention in where the directional cue is pointing to, you will need some time to then switch attentional focus to the other side. And that can be seen in reaction times when you compare those two conditions, the validly cued targets and the invalidly cued targets. So as I say, we've done a number of studies on gaze cueing, but I won't go much into detail in those. I just wanted to mention one other factor that is very, very important in gaze cueing. Because it's about gaze, we ask the question, what happens when a robot engages participants in mutual gaze first? So mutual gaze, as we know, is a very, very strong social signal and can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. And we wanted to see whether the gaze cueing effect is modulated by whether the robot engages in mutual gaze. So this is an example actually of how you translate, very classical paradigms like these. So abstract stimuli on the screen into something that's more embodied where the robot is their physical presence. So here what you can see is the robot between two screens, engages participants first in eye contact, and then shifts, directional cue to one of the screens, and then we present the target letter on one or the other screen. So this will be an invalid cue. And then there's a condition of no eye contact where the robot looks down. It's a little bit more salient when you actually sit in front of the robot as compared to the video. And so to cut the long story short, what we see is that the difference between valid and invalid conditions of the gaze cueing effect, meaning participants engaging in that directional cue, is there after eye contact condition and is not there in the no eye contact condition. This was, the story is a little bit more complicated, but I don't want to go into detail. So if you're interested in that particular topic, I'll be happy to discuss later, because this effect depends very much on the time that it passes between the onset of the directional cue and the target location, the so-called stimulus onset asynchrony. But anyway, what we found and then replicated many, many times is that under certain SOA conditions, this pattern holds, meaning that the eye contact is relevant and important for participants. And you would think like, well, it's kind of obvious, right? Because I mean, eye contact, we know that is very, very important. But take into account that this is a robot. These are two cameras, but yet they mean something to participants. They engage them more in attention. And in fact, when we also ask participants to rate how much engaged they felt in the interaction after a block of trials, we found always, independent of anything else, a higher engagement rating for the eye contact as compared to no eye contact condition. So we found this in subjective reports. We also looked at eye movement data and fixation durations. So we also observe more or longer fixations on the eye contact compared to no eye contact condition when we look at when we analyze fixation durations on the face of the robot. And then we also looked at EEG during the eye contact or no eye contact condition, and we found more desynchronized alpha activity in the eye contact condition. Then we looked into literature, what does desynchronized alpha actually mean, and we found that this is a marker of more engagement in the task. So all these measures show that eye contact with the robot actually matters for participants, and again, take into account that this is just a robot, right? So it's interesting to see how the robot kind of hijacks our mechanisms that we've developed to interact with other humans in interaction with an artifact, right? Okay, so social gaze, I call it social gaze because, yeah, it does have some impact on the social attention mechanisms. From a robot modulates attention, orienting, and engagement. And now I'll tell you a story that as I say, this was our very first beginnings. And I'll tell you a story that is super, super fun because the game was really, really fun. Also about neutral gaze and how much it actually matters for our cognitive processes. So this is about gaze and decision making. Here we engaged participants in a game that was a competitive game with ICAP. And it's called the chicken game. The reason, I'll tell you in a moment why it's a chicken game. But basically what happens in the game is that you're seated opposite to ICAP at a table where the screen is positioned flat on the table. So you have horizontal screen between you. And you have a simulated car. ICAP has a simulated car. The cars start going towards one another. And as they approach the middle point, everything goes blank. And you need to make a decision whether you want to continue or deviate. Okay? Now, if you both continue and you crash, you both lose a lot of points. Okay? If you deviate, but your opponent goes straight, the opponent gains more points than you. And vice versa. So you need to risk a little bit, but you need to be careful because it all depends on what your opponent will do. Now, why is it a chicken game? Because you shouldn't chicken out too early and too much, right? You should take a risk to some extent. So here's the payoff matrix, which basically shows what I just explained to you. So you should be careful not to crash to lose the points. Now, the important manipulation that we've done is that as the screen went blank and participants were making the decision, the robot either looked them in the eyes or looked away. Okay? So it's kind of a poker situation. You're just about to make your next move, and your opponent looks you in the eyes. What does that do to your decision making, right? We manipulated this across two groups, so what is the subject design, in which the mutual gaze group saw mutual gaze 80% of trials and averted gaze 20%, because we wanted to make sure that everybody is exposed to both conditions. But we wanted to have a group which sees more of one or the other. And this was also done to see whether whatever effects we find is not because of just simple probabilities, but actually of mutual gaze. Okay, so this is how the paradigm looked. You see, in the actual game, the robot's hand was occluded, so participants didn't see what the robot chose. But this is just to show you that the robot was actually pressing the buttons, and participants heard the buttons being pressed. So here the cars start, now everything goes blank, and this is when the robot looks into the eyes of the participant. And as that was happening, we were measuring EEG again in this paradigm. Yeah, this is the Okay, so these are the results First, we looked at response times, when participants were, making the decision of whether to go ahead on or deviate. In the mutual gaze, independent of the group, sorry, it was 70 and 30, not 80-20, apologies. In the mutual gaze and in the averted gaze group, under the mutual gaze condition, people were slower. And that doesn't depend on probability, as you see, because no matter whether they saw mutual more often or averted more often, they always were slower in the mutual gaze, as compared to averted gaze. Now, this is already quite interesting, but we also found other interesting things. So we looked again at the EEG during the gaze contact period. And this time, we saw higher synchronization in alpha during the mutual gaze condition. And now, this was a puzzle for us. Why higher synchronization? So we started digging into literature, and higher synchronization in alpha band has been observed in previous studies as a marker of suppression of irrelevant signals. So what happened was that people understood that the mutual gaze is distracting. They were trying to suppress that mutual gaze, and that cost them time, right? So this, as you have seen in the reaction times, right? So this additional mechanism was costly, and that was observable in the response. Now, we also did another analysis on the strategies that people took during the game. And these were implicit strategies because when we asked them explicitly, they couldn't say. Sometimes they said that at first they were trying to figure out whether the mutual gaze predicts something, but then they gave up. For sure, they didn't respond any of these strategies, which are basically standard kind of strategies that are analyzed in social decision-making tasks. Win, stay, lose, shift. So if you win on a given trial, you stay with that same strategy for the next trial. If you lose, you shift your strategy, right? Then tit for tat, you do what your opponent did in the previous trial, right? And stay, shift imitations, basically you imitate your opponent with respect to whether you stay or shift. Now, interestingly, this was the most optimal strategy in the task. When you analyze across trials, you look at the occurrence of win, stay, lose, shift strategy. And as I said, this one was the most optimal strategy. And interestingly, also the robot was programmed with this strategy in 80% of trials. Now, if you look at the occurrence rate of that strategy, you see that in the averted gaze, it was more often chosen as compared to mutual. So participants in the non-social condition chose more often the better strategy, right? And this is very, very interesting because we have 3 pieces of evidence that in this particular task, the social gaze was very disruptive for participants. It delayed them. It required additional cognitive mechanisms involved in the brain. And it made them choose suboptimal strategies. So gaze acts as a very strong social signal, but that can be distracting, actually. And as I said, delayed response times makes people choose suboptimal strategies and engages suppression mechanisms. So social robots and social signals are not always beneficial for human performance. This is a take-home message that I repeat very often to roboticists is that it very much depends on the context and task and application that you want to use the robot for. Because if you want your users, participants to be focused and to employ cognitive control mechanisms, don't make the robot social because they'll be distracting. And actually this finding, together with some other findings that we have from the lab on cognitive control, we have more and more indications of that there is this antagonistic relationship between the social brain and cognitive control. So yeah, it depends on what you want to target in your application for social robots. All right, so that's it on the social signals. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the intentional stance towards robot. That's a topic that is very, very dear to me because that was the topic of my ERC grant that ended, and we have dedicated many, many years and many people and many experiments to this topic. So let me tell you a few words about what intentional stance is. It's a concept from a philosophical concept from Daniel Dennett. The idea is that when you interact with other humans, you predict and explain behavior of the other humans with reference to mental states. So if I see someone reaching out for a glass of water, I explain their behavior that they want to drink, they believe that water will ease their thirst, and wanting, believing are mental states, right? On the other hand, you can have a design stance towards an artifact when you explain or predict behaviors with reference to how the system was designed to behave. So if a coffee machine is pouring coffee at some point, it stops, you don't explain this behavior as coffee machine wanted to be mean to you. No, it was just designed this way, right? Now, you can probably already imagine that humanoid robots are interesting because they might be somewhere in between in terms of what they evoke, intentional or design stance. On the one hand, they look like humans, behave like humans, so humans are tempted to adopt the intentional stance. But on the other hand, we know that these are artifacts, right? So we should adopt a design stance, like towards the coffee machine. So actually, the entire project was about understanding under what conditions, when, and if at all, people adopted intentional stance towards humanoid robots. But before we could get there, and actually I didn't realize that when I was writing the project proposal, is that one needs to operationalize the question of intentional stance. It's a philosophical question. It took us a year, basically, to get there. An entire team was involved in this. And we were trying to find a measure of how much intentional stance do people actually adopt, right, in a given situation. How do you measure this? So we designed this intentional stance test, which basically comprises of 34 roughly scenarios. This is one scenario, so a triplet, like this is one scenario. Okay, and you see that there is a story developing in these scenarios. And then there are two descriptions about that scenario. And one is using mentalistic terminology, so intentional stance terminology. ICAB was trying to cheat by looking at opponents' cards. Or ICAB was unbalanced, very mechanistic description. Now, and participants have to choose which of these descriptions they think fits better to the scenario. This way, you can quantify the level, the degree to which they adopt intentional stance, right? So if you just basically say, okay, on this extreme it's 0 and on this extreme it's 100, then you have a number. And we quantified in such a way that 0 would be mechanistic, completely mechanistic, 100 would be intentional. And what we have observed is that on average, in general population, the score is around 42. I like that number. For those of you who read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know why. It's actually in reality somewhere between 40 and 45, but I like to put the 42 here because that's the answer. On average, it's about 42, which means that they are slightly towards the mechanistic stance, but not completely, right? And the interesting thing is that we realize that it very much varies across participants. So you would, like, if you take the intentional stance, you would be rather consistent in your responses, and vice versa. So then we looked into various factors, like what are those individual differences? We saw that education, both in terms of number of years, but also in terms of type of education matter. So roboticists wouldn't adopt the intentional stance. Clearly we had this is at wrong. I hope this will not all the time. What we've done once is an experiment where we compared roboticists with psychotherapists, and we saw huge differences. It was very difficult to find the comparison group for roboticists. We thought, like, we would like to have the same amount of education in years, but someone who doesn't have experience with robots, but on the other hand, has a lot of experience. How can I kill this? That it doesn't show up. I'm afraid I'll need to. Oh, does anyone have an idea?
I think you should turn off Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So I'll need to take this, and I was worried that this will not. And now we're back, hopefully. Okay. Now I have a completely different setup here. Good that you see the same thing here. So yeah, we were thinking of, like, whom to choose, who has a lot of experience with mentalizing, right, with thinking about mental states of others, but has the same amount of education. So we came up with psychotherapists, and the results were beautiful because they really differed a lot in this score. Anyway, what I wanted to show you here is the test, and what we later have done was we used EEG while participants were solving the test, and we wanted to see whether we can find some neural markers of intentional stance. Right, so we're going from super high level philosophical concepts to neural data, and I thought this would not work, but actually it did. And we had to modify the design a little bit to avoid artifacts that were related to reading, because we didn't want to have people moving their eyes. So actually they heard the sentence. Anyway, these are details of the paradigm if you want. So I can explain it later in the discussion. And we wanted to see whether EEG signal just before they release their spacebar to choose where they want to go with the slider, whether this could be somehow indicative of the choice they will make. Now, remember what I told you, that people are very consistent with their responses. So if someone is an intentional stance person, they will stay with the intentional stance. So we couldn't compare trials within subjects. We had to compare between groups of people. So we basically did a median split, and we took those who were intentional and those who were mechanistic on the other hand. And we do see a difference in the gamma band activity in that period just before so they already made the decision where they want to go with the slider, and they're just later on going. And that kind of activity in those channels, gamma activity, is related to mentalizing, according to literature. So you can basically compare two groups, the design or the intentional stance groups, and you see a difference in their brain. This is cool. But even cooler is something that we thought could not be possible, and it was. It was one of these findings that we couldn't dream that would come true. We also, apart from looking at the EEG activity during the task, we asked participants before they did the task, we asked them to just sit and relax, and we measured their EEG. So that is called resting state EEG, right? So they just think about whatever they want to do, and they haven't seen the robot. They don't know what the task is going to be. They have no idea. And while they're doing this, we're measuring their EEG. And what we observed is a difference, again, between the two groups in beta activity on those channels. And this pattern of activity has been reported in literature as related to the default mode network, which is related to social cognition. So basically, at the resting state, before any interaction with the robot, you can already see differences in the type of attitude that people would have towards the robot later on during the task. So that was really, really fascinating for us. And actually, this resting state activity is also what we measured across roboticists and psychotherapists, and we found differences. Okay, good. So humans do differ in their likelihood of adopting the intentional stance, and this difference can be already detected in the resting state EEG. Now, I was telling you about like the baseline attitude that people have towards a robot, right? Now, what is interesting for us is whether you can modulate that attitude. So this number 42, can you increase it or decrease it depending on the robot behavior or appearance? We are looking into behavior mainly. So to do that, we ran a number of experiments in which we programmed the robot to either have human-like eye movements or human-like subtle behaviors. And we asked participants to observe the robot, and we did the task, and it didn't work. And we spent like more than a year on data that didn't work, or we didn't observe any difference in the intentional stance. But then we thought, maybe what matters is that they should actually be interacting with the robot rather than just observing, because that's when things matter, when you start interacting with the robot. So we switched our approach completely into an interactive scenario where the behaviors were not so subtle anymore. They were actually really salient behaviors, and we engaged participants in an interaction. So we thought of a situation where they would do something very social with the robot that would create some sort of a bonding maybe between the humans and the robot, and but that the robot still can do, because that's also another constraint that we often have, what the robot can do. So we thought about movie watching together. We do this with friends. It's a familiar action. It creates bonding. So let's watch movies together with the robot. And what we've done is the intentional stance pre-interaction, then the intentional stance post-interaction, the task in between, and then we want to compare whether we can increase the score from pre to post. Now, during the movie watching, there were two conditions. In one condition, the robot would respond to the events in the movie in a very human-like way and in an emotional way. So when there was something that was funny, it would laugh. When there was something scary, it would be scared, and it would respond accordingly. In the other condition, it was very mechanistic. So it would just maybe let me show you the first, because it's super funny, the behaviors. So what you'll see here is they're watching on this screen, they're watching this, right? Together. It is quite funny, the giggling of the robot, and you see that you also respond emotionally. So we evoke this sort of emotional attunement in people when the robot is responding like this. And in the other condition, the robot would also have behaviors exactly at the same time points of the video, but it would be like very mechanistic, like it would be beeping, like your car sensor is beeping when you're approaching an obstacle. It would go like beep, 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 beep. Kind of stuff. So, and there was no interaction before the movie watching. In the mechanistic condition, was just calibrating cameras, calibrating motors, while in the human-like, it said hi to participants, said its name, do you want to watch movies? So it was like social interaction beforehand. These are the results. So in the first experiment, we observed a very significant increase in the intentional stance from pre to post. I didn't believe this at first, because after all these failed experiments, I was like, I want to see this again. So I asked to run the experiment again with a completely different sample of participants. So we replicated this effect. And from there onwards, we replicated many, many, many times, even across continents. We ran this also in Singapore, and we see the same effect. Experiment 3 is the mechanistic condition. So there is no difference, as you see, between pre and post. And that was actually important because it's not just the exposure to the robot, right? It's the actual emotional reactions and the kind of bond that it creates. So yes, it is possible to have to increase the likelihood of adopting the intentional stance by manipulating robot behavior. And with this, I'll finish the chapter on intentional stance. I just wanted to tell you that I'm very proud of this. This is our book that came out in December 2024, last December, that summarizes basically all the studies that we've done on intentional stance. It was a 6 years project, so it was a lot. And if you're interested, I will be very happy to tell you more about the book. So yeah, we learned a lot of lessons about when and if people adopt intentional stance, what it means for actually interaction, and all those lessons are there in that book. Now, I'll tell you very briefly about another experiment that is on a topic that is somehow related to intentional stance, but a little bit different. It was just one experiment, but I think it's pretty cool, so that's why I show it to you. An experiment on so-called nonverbal Turing test, we called it. So basically what happens here is that participants in the robot are doing a task, a very simple task. It was a Simon task. So they just need to respond, it's a joint Simon task. So they need to respond to one color. For example, she responds to green and the robot responds to red. Super simple task. The interesting manipulation for us is that in some conditions, this robot is pre-programmed, and in some other conditions, it's controlled by the participant in the other cabin. They don't see each other, they don't hear each other, there's a wall in between. The doors are, of course, closed during the experiment. So they're doing this either with the robot or with a human controlling the robot, and they need to answer whether you think you actually played with another human or with a pre-programmed robot. this is a reaction time task. So they don't have any other data than the distribution of reaction times across the experiment, right? And it's super subtle, super subtle hints that they can use. So typically they say that they don't know, they're guessing, right? But in fact, I won't show you the video of this. Sorry, this is just to show you how we programmed the robot to respond. So this is basically, these were data taken from dyads of humans. We just modified the distribution in such a way that was much more narrow. We actually wanted to have a uniform distribution, but the robot has some variability in terms of the delays when you send the command and when it presses. So that's why it looks like this. But as you see, it's very, very narrow. This is the actual human presses. So this is the data that they have, right? Our participants. And what we observe is that actually they do have sensitivity to the human behavior. So because this is significantly above chance. Well, this one is at chance. So when they're playing with the actual robot, the pre-programmed robot, and they can't tell. There are two messages from this. On the one hand, importantly, one can say that the human brain has sensitivity to these very subtle human-like behaviors and the distribution variability in these behaviors that is human-like. On the other hand, one can say that in a sense, the robot passed the Turing test, right? Because they wouldn't be able to tell whether it was a human or a robot. And so, yes, this is basically what I just said. And the behavioral variability within this human-like range, but still different from a human distribution, blurs the distinction between the human and the machine. So that was a very short digression. I have very little time, but I can speak a little bit more than 1 hour. Yes, okay, good. Because now comes another big topic in my lab, sense of agency. I'm very much interested in sense of agency, so now I'm shifting from intentional stance to sense of agency. And I'll show you some selected studies, not all of them, because we really run many on sense of agency that are, I think, the most interesting. So what is sense of agency? Is the feeling of being in control over self-generated actions and their outcomes, right? When I press a button to switch the light on and the light goes on, I feel in control over that action effect. So it's the relationship between my voluntary actions and the goals that I want to achieve with those actions and the action outcomes, which are sensory, right? It's an extremely important mechanism that for us in general, and it is very important in all sorts of applications in robotics. So I show this because I usually show this to roboticists to tell them how actually important this is. If you think about joint action, this is a situation where you need to discriminate between who's in control, right, when you're doing things together, and or you might develop something that I'll be talking about, sense of joint agency. So you're actually doing this together as a team and you have this joint sense of agency. It's very important in teleoperation. Think about surgical robots where you're actually performing actions not with your own effector, but with remote device. And the consequences, sensory consequences of that action are also like sometimes very distant and so on. And do you actually develop a sense of agency of your actions? This is super, super important and cannot be neglected and has been neglected so far in these kind of application scenarios. And then, of course, one of the big topics, something that I'm exploring in collaboration with my colleagues at the Technical University in Munich, is prosthetics. Because keep in mind that what I said earlier, the relationship between your action intention and the sensory outcome thereof. The sensory outcome is typically not only the light, but you also have haptic information, right? You feel what it's like to touch that button. Patients with prosthetics don't have that, right? They do not have the sensory feedback from the foot, from the limb that is artificial, so they don't feel in control over those prosthetics. And now one of the very important topics in robotics is how to substitute that sensory modality with another modality and whether people can relearn that association through a different modality. So it's a very important topic for robotics. It's super interesting for cognitive psychology, I think, and that's why we're looking into that in all sorts of directions. Here, one point I wanted to make is that there's an interesting distinction here between robots as partners and robots as tools, right? Because in this kind of joint action, you can treat a robot as a social partner, and there are very interesting sense of agency effects occurring then, and I'll talk about them later. In teleoperation, it can be your partner, and you'll see situations where we're teleoperating a humanoid robot, right, where it's maybe helping you with a task. That can be a partner, even though it's kind of a tool, but it's somewhere in between. That's why it's somewhere in between partners and tools, and then prosthetics is clearly a tool. So let me just show you again what type of experiments we're doing, but I'll be talking mainly about this case. So we're interested in individual sense of agency in social context, but also in teleoperation. This is an interesting study where participants are controlling the robot to point to different locations where they can collect points. And one of the very interesting questions in teleoperation is the relationship between your sense of control and the level of autonomy that the system has, right? So the system might be trying to help you, but you might not like it because you're losing control, right? And this, one has to very well balance these two aspects in teleoperation. If you think about autonomous vehicles, same story, right? In this experiment, we actually showed, this was like just very preliminary data, but what we looked at was there's a subjective experience of performance, and they thought that they performed better under the full control condition as compared to the robot autonomy. So the robot was helping them to collect points, and they thought they were performing better under control condition, but actually in reality, the robot, because it was helping, they were performing better with autonomy. So people like to be in control. They overestimate their performance when they're in control, and they do not like to give up on control. I think it's super fascinating. So that's one topic. Another one is vicarious sense of agency. This is a situation where you're acting with another partner, human or robot in this case, and you actually experience similar sense of agency, or you show similar mechanisms of sense of agency when the robot is performing or the human is performing the action as you yourself. So it's kind of like, a contagious sense of agency. Very interesting aspect, but I won't talk about this today. And then the joint sense of agency, or rather sense of joint agency in social context. So I'll focus on this one, on the last one. So sense of joint agency is a situation where you create a sort of a situation, of course this is all happening implicitly, of a teamwork. So you're in control of actions and their consequences as a team. So actually it doesn't matter whether I'm the one who's pressing the button or my partner is pressing the button. When the light goes on, I feel in control, independent of who of the dyad was the one pressing the button. This is a very, very interesting phenomenon observed in human-human interaction. We looked at whether that would happen also with robots. So the way we operationalized this was a task that was employed in literature before. We asked participants to perform a task where they need to move a cursor to a target location, okay? Or one of the persons in the dyad is moving the cursor towards a target location, and the other one is confirming when the cursor lands on the location, okay? So there's a mover with several button presses, it moves. Then once the target is there, we call it detector, the partner who's detecting is confirming. And after a certain delay, there is a tone. And I will tell you why in a moment, because this was done in order to measure the intentional binding effect, which I will talk about in a second. So basically the phenomenon that when you are in control of your actions, your experience, subjective perception of the time between the action and the sensory outcome shrinks as compared to a situation where the sensory outcome is externally generated, or when you're generating an action involuntarily, like for example, where your finger is pressed by a lever. So that's why we did this manipulation here in order to measure the intentional binding effect. Now, as you can imagine, this can be done solo because you can be doing this with two hands, right? Mover, detector, or with a partner where one of the partners is the left hand, the other is the right hand. And yeah, let me show how it looked. So now the robot was the mover, the participant was the detector, and now you have to estimate in the task how much time has passed between the landing point of the target and the tone that you have heard. Okay? And this is the phenomenon that I was mentioning, the intentional binding paradigm temporal compression effect, that the interval between the voluntary action and the sensory effect shrinks, is compressed compared to situations where you're not in control. Now, what were the hypotheses here? I know it's a little bit complicated, so please bear with me. I'll try to explain this. So if you form a sense of joint agency, then it should not matter who did the final press, right? Because we're acting as a team. So whether I pressed or my partner pressed, I should experience the same compression of time across these two conditions, and also with the solo condition. And that's what has been observed in literature. If sense of agency is not formed, so I don't act as a team, but I'm doing my stuff, you're doing your stuff, right? Then I'm actually in charge only when I'm doing the last move. I'm the detector, I'm the one who's confirming, right? But when I'm the mover, it's my partner who's confirming, so I'm not responsible for that action outcome. Therefore, the compression should not be there as much as for these other two conditions. So basically, I hope this is clear. Yeah. So basically, if you see a difference between these two, mainly these two conditions, that means that this sense of joint agency has not been formed, while if you don't see a difference, it has been formed. Now we employed this paradigm, and we had three conditions: human-human, just to replicate the previous literature, human-robot, without any prior introduction to the robot, and human and intentional robot. We increased intentionality by the manipulation that I showed you earlier, by this movie watching together. So just to show you the manipulation check, this is just to show that the manipulation worked. People did increase the intentional stance score before and after the movie watching here. And also when you compare the starting point, because we did this, of course, before the experiment, the starting point of the experiment between the group that had this manipulation compared to the group that didn't have the manipulation, you also see a difference. So they start from a different point in terms of intentional stance. Okay. Now here are the data. When you have a human-human condition, we replicated the results from literature, so there's no difference. Sense of joint agency is formed here. When you do the experiment with ICAP as a partner without the intentionality manipulation, just do it with the robot, you see that there is a difference between those two conditions, so they do not form sense of joint agency. And then finally, when you do the manipulation with the intentional stance, the results are similar to the human condition. So when they have attributed intentionality to the robot, they show very similar effects to the human. It's a very powerful manipulation, it seems. Now we've seen this in interval estimates. We looked at the N1 effect, the auditory N1, which has been many times shown as a marker of sense of agency, especially to auditory signals. And this is hard to see here, but I can tell you that the pattern of results is very similar to behavior, and this is exactly the same data, just plotted differently so that you can see it a little bit better. So you see that the unintentional robot, there is a difference between those two conditions, as you see here, and the intentional robot, there is no difference. And this is the N1 amplitude, N100 amplitude, and we also looked at functional connectivity in theta band between the frontocentral and temporal electrodes, and we see the same pattern as in N1. So N1 is probably the effect of this long-range connectivity, that because theta is responsible for long-range connectivity in the brain, which is really cool because we just saw this effect across all the measures that we had, very, very reliable and stable. So humans are capable of forming sense of joint agency with a humanoid robot, but only if is perceived as intentional. So what is intentional stands good for these kind of mechanisms that are crucial for teamwork, right? If we want to have good teamwork with robots, we need to somehow make sure that participants perceive them as intentional agents. Otherwise, they're just machines, and these kind of mechanisms won't work, and they're very, very important. Now, I wanted to tell you quickly, again, because I like this study, and I think I'm not that far away from the end, about individual sense of agency in a social context. Because if you think about sense of agency and you read literature, it's always button press tone, sometimes some visual stimulus upon a button press. It's super artificial, right? And in the end, I mean, how often do we do button presses and hear tones, right? So we wanted to do something more ecologically valid, and we thought, when do we actually care about our action consequences? I mean, we often care, but we really care when there are social consequences, right? So when I do something and I observe a consequence of that action on my partner, as an expression, for example, an emotional expression. So that's what we try to implement here, together with our colleagues from IT who are helping us out with algorithms to detect mutual gaze from the robot's cameras, and who are able to detect when the participant is actually looking at the robot, which is exactly what we wanted to do. So we wanted to have an action that is more natural rather than button presses. People are asked to look at the robot, and the robot will respond after it detects the gaze at the robot. It will respond either, and we did two manipulations, either with an emotional expression, so it will be either happy or sad dependent on the condition. When I look at it, it becomes happy, or when I look at it, it becomes sad. It's a pretty strong social effect. You will see the video in a moment. Or we did the mutual gaze manipulation. So participants look at the robot, and then it looks back at them, or looks away. And what does it do to our sense of agency? So let me show you the experiments. This is the sad happy. Experiment 1, sad face. So the participants looking at the screen, and at some point they look at the robot. And now it was sad when they looked at the robot. Yeah? And now they need to do the temporal estimate, and then a happy face. Now the participant looks, and the robot is. And experiment 2 looked like this. So this is the one with mutual gaze or averted gaze. The same thing, people are looking at the screen. At some point it says, now you can look at the robot whenever you want. They look at the robot whenever they want, and the robot will respond either with mutual or averted gaze. So this is mutual gaze. It always, here we kept constant the smile, so it was always smile in this case. Well, it is a much more salient consequence of your action than a tone, right, after pressing a key. Here are the results. So for the emotional expressions, we didn't see a difference in, the interval estimates. We think that this is because the sad and happy are still very, very limited on this robot specifically, right? I mean, these are LEDs, these are not really emotional expressions, so we didn't see much of a difference. But we saw a huge difference in mutual versus averted. So in the mutual gaze, you see that the temporal compression was much more compressed, the temporal estimates, and that means that there was much more sense of agency experienced over a situation where the robot looked back and engaged in mutual gaze. So when I look at someone and that someone looks back, I feel really in control over that situation, right? And the other one, I feel less in control, relatively. Okay, so when the action outcomes are social, the type of outcome actually really matters. And this is something that has been completely under-investigated in the literature, again, going back to the tones. That there's more and more literature on these emotional expressions with smileys and stuff, but not so much in this really embodied situation where you're facing the robot sitting in front of you. Okay, the last bit is about applied work that we do. So I would say 80% of my work is in the lab and it's very fundamental research that you have seen. And the remaining 20 we dedicate to developing training protocols for children diagnosed with autism. Now, why, for those of you who are maybe not so much into the topic, it has been shown in literature that kids with autism respond very well to robots. They're happy to play with robots. And if you bring a robot to a place where there are kids diagnosed with autism, they will be completely mesmerized by the robot. So if that's the case, maybe one can use this as an opportunity to train social skills. And by training social skills, again, what we do in our lab is that we, again, draw inspiration from basic science, and we think about the mechanisms. So we're really targeting our training protocols on very specific cognitive mechanisms that we know are impaired in children with autism. So this was an incredible mission, I must say, to start this project. Now we have a robot in the rehabilitation center in Genoa already for more than 3 years, I think. It's there, stationary, and it's therapists do. So the way it works is that for each session that the therapist has with a kid, within that session we have like 10 minutes for those kids that undergo the robot assisted training, 10 minutes of interaction with the robots. And we have usually a crossover design. So there's a group of kids that start with standard therapy, then they do the standard plus robot, and another group that starts with standard plus robot and then does the standard only. Yeah, why was that a mission to Mars almost? Because it was really, we had to do everything from scratch. The entire setup, we needed to make sure that everybody's safe. And if you look at this robot, I mean, it's very easy to put the little kid's finger just in the motors and everybody's injured, right? The kids, the robot, and so we really wanted to have an embodied interaction because we believe that embodiment matters for cognitive skills in general. So we wanted the kids to use their body in the training. Not otherwise, why would you use a robot? You can use a screen, right? So we wanted to have an interaction, but at the same time, we needed to make sure that the kids are not coming too close to the robot. So we designed all this by ourselves in our institute. So in order to have an interaction, we wanted to have a handover of objects. We thought of this kind of setup where the kid is choosing an object and passing it to a robot through this kind of drawer. Then the robot can pick up the object, do something with the object, pass it back to the kid. So there is an interaction, but not direct. There is this screen that protects the kids from touching the robot. And then, of course, on both sides and also under the table, everywhere there is the screen. Some kids still manage to jump over. That's why we always have a therapist next to the kids so that they could intervene in case. And and we designed also those cubes. So these are the objects that they pass between the robot and themselves for various training. So we started off with visual spatial perspective taking. And the idea here was that this is the setup, the final setup. And the idea is that the kid chooses one of the cubes. So you see stickers on the cube, different stickers on each side. And they pass it to the robot. The robot takes the cube and rotates it. And the degree of rotation depends on the severity of the impairment of the kid. And once it rotates, the kid needs to tell what does the robot see. So they need to understand that the perspective of the robot is different from their perspective, right? They have the copy of that cube in their hand so that it doesn't become a memory task because it will be difficult for us to do, to memorize what is on which side of the cube. So they can rotate themselves the cube and understand, okay, if I see this side of the cube, the robot opposite to me sees the other side. Right? And this is just to demonstrate. So it's not you'll see the video in a moment, but there's no screen because this was just for demonstration purpose of the action of the robot. So it takes this one. I think will be a very simple rotation, but we have more degrees of rotation in some cases. And you see the kid has the cube and can compare to what they see and what they think the robot is in front of them. Okay, so they undergo this kind of training, and we measure with clinical measures. The therapist is measuring their skills with clinical scales. So this specific scale is an EPSI scale that has a subscale of theory of mind, and we looked at the delta, so pre versus post, in the traditional therapy and ICAP assisted. So the delta means if the higher it is, that means that there is an improvement after 8 weeks, I think, of training, and we see improvement in ICAP assisted training, but no improvement in the traditional training. Importantly, really importantly here is that this test is done with a therapist. So, and they train visual spatial perspective, but then they're tested on the theory of mind and other subscales. So they kind of develop various social skills based on such a super basic mechanism, right? And this is just to show that it's not the training itself, not the protocol itself, because if you do it with another robot, a small Cosmo robot, commercial robot, we did exactly the same with the difference that the therapist had to place the cube. But again, the same question, what does the robot see? And there is no improvement between traditional and Cosmo-assisted training. But this is the data I showed you earlier. ICAP helps. So yeah, ICAP is special, and it's in those last slides on the clinical applications, you'll see how special it is. Then we moved on to joint attention. We again wanted to make, so from visual spatial perspective, another training, joint attention, so following those directional cues, which children often have problems with. And here we again wanted to make it more realistic, so not just that the robot would gaze, but that they're engaged in a setting that is something that resembles their daily life. So they go to, I don't know, a pizzeria, and they want to order a pizza, and the robot, or to a cinema, and they ask for a ticket to a movie, and the robot says, which movie would you like to see? There are posters, and the robot is pointing. Now what we can do with this is, so pointing is already joint attention, there's also gaze. What we can do with this is to play with the complexity of the cues. So there can be only gazing, gazing plus pointing, all sorts of things, dependent again on the progress of the kid and the individual needs of the kids. So we are very inclusive, so we have kids that are very impaired and those who are more higher functioning, and then dependent on individual differences, we adapt the complexity. So I wanted to show you this because it's hilarious. Here's a cinema. And as you see, the robot is standing, trying to ask, which movie would you like to see? This is all the visuals were actually developed with the therapists. They were telling us a lot of hints on it. And then the same procedure, so basically the robot takes the cube and then gives the kid the ticket to that movie, and vice versa. They can play roles, so it can be either the kid or the robot. So with this training, we had really, really interesting effects. So basically, group 1 undergoes the robot-assisted training between T0 and T1. You see a huge improvement, again, on the theory of mind on the NEPSI scale. They improve here. Here, they didn't have the robot-assisted training anymore. They had just a standard therapy, but they maintained the skill that they acquired. Now, this group did not have the robot-assisted training at first. They got the robot-assisted training here. So clearly, the robot helps in improving social skills. Now, we did exactly the same protocol with the pointing and all these scenarios with a human, because we wanted to have a human comparison, and there's no improvement. So it's ICAP. It does something to kids with autism, and it's very, very promising, I think, avenue to help them in, especially that they love it. They absolutely love interaction with ICAP. They scream at home because they want to be in the rehabilitation center. Therapists were telling us all sorts of anecdotes where they had kids that wouldn't be able in the past sit through the therapy, and then when the robot came, they're mesmerized. They're doing the task even though they wouldn't do tasks in the past. So I think this is all very, very promising, and I want to conclude this part on training. Social cognitive mechanisms with the assistant of a humanoid robot improves children's performance. So now I'll move to the general conclusions, and I wanted to tell you how one can actually draw conclusions for both fields on the same sort of results. So if I think about messages and guidelines for roboticists, based on this study, as you remember, this was the chicken game. what I can say is, well, social signals in human-robot interaction are not always beneficial, so think about what kind of application you want to have when you design the robot. Don't always make them social with social signals. Now you might remember the Turing test. It's very important to have human-like variability, even in super subtle behaviors of the robot, because human brain is sensitive to that. So if we want to make robots appear human-like and social, we need to design that into the robots. Intentional stance. This was the sense of joint agency study, and what we showed is that the intentional stance can improve various basic mechanisms underlying cooperation, such as sense of joint agency, so that also needs to be taken into account in design of robots. And then knowledge and methods from cognitive neuroscience can be used for efficacious robot-assisted training. This is quite an important point because there's a lot of approaches in social robotics where robots are taken into clinical settings and they interact with kids, but there's no clear protocol that is based really on targeting specific mechanisms, and that I think is the difference why this thing really works. Now, the opposite direction, what have we learned in cognitive neuroscience from these experiments in humanoids? Well, I already mentioned this, that there is an interesting, potentially interesting antagonistic relationship between cognitive control and the social brain. That the brain has developed a mechanism to discriminate human-like behaviors, even very subtle, and that's very interesting to understand further in future research. Then the intentional stance towards robots can be observed at the neural level and is modulated by robots' behavior, and it is crucial for a sense of joint agency. And then the training protocols can also inform us, so it's not only about application, but can also inform us about the specific mechanisms of cognition that actually translate to social skills. So using them, we can not only help, but we can also learn something. And very last slides, the social robots, our vision is one day to have social robots like this, being with us, helping us out in all sorts of tasks, in childcare, elderly care. This is what the social robotics dreams of that. In reality, we are quite far from this. Very not up to the task, and very far from taking over the world. So, yeah, what do we need to get there? What do we need to do? We need to do this. And I hope I convinced you with the importance of bridging those two disciplines. And with this, I would like to thank my team at the IIT, and thank you very much for your attention.